Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. Thousands of teachers have left their unions in recent years, and other organizations are offering services as alternatives to those provided by the nation's largest teacher unions. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, many teachers have left their unions in recent years. What initiated this exit?
Yeah, Eliana, that's a great question. There's a couple of things I think that you could point to there. The first one, and probably the biggest one, is a 2018 Supreme Court decision in a case called Janus v. AFSCME. Like it's the like a union essentially, and basically the Mark Janus, who Janus is named after, he basically said, I don't want to pay agency dues to this union because essentially this is compelled speech. Like if I give money to my union, they'll take that money and they put it on political ads that I don't agree with. So this violates my First Amendment rights. Like this violates my constitutional rights. And there's, I believe he was in a state where there was no right to work law, so he couldn't get out of the union. And the union said, in order to work here at this place of work, you will have to be in the union and you do have to pay fees so that, you can work here. And he said, no, that's not right. And he was a public employee. And so that is set up this case law, right, where public employees, the Supreme Court in 2018 ruled that public employees must consent to pay union dues and agency fees. Then that tricky thing is there is the agency fees, right? Like there's like some specifics in the language here that really, gets into like labor law and some of these like NLRB stuff, like you like the National Labor Relations Board. Like there's like sort of like this whole jargon basically for employment law and different kinds of union filings, like decertification, that kind of stuff. And it's just like ways to kind of talk about this. And it's sort of its own whole thing. But essentially the Supreme Court said that public employees have to affirmatively consent and say, yes, I want to give my dues and agency fees to the union, and that they can opt out. They can say, I don't want to do that anymore. And to continue to take money from them and pay it to the union would violate their constitutional, like First Amendment rights. So you cannot force a public employee to continue to pay dues to the union, like, and have their job, conditioned, and like you can't take that, because it basically saying that your money is a First Amendment sort of extension, right? Like if you're paying money to a union, they're taking that money and they're doing political things with it. They're doing an ad campaign for a candidate they like, and maybe you don't, or maybe they have an ideological persuasion that you don't agree with, and that could be at the state or the national level as well. So as you mentioned, there's a couple of big teachers unions that teachers are talking about, and Mark Janus was not a teacher; he was a public employee, but this would apply to all public sector employees. So that's sort of the background, like in a nutshell. There is that opened the door for a lot of public employees around the country to say, "Hey, I don't want to be in the union anymore. I don't want to pay dues or agency fees to the union." And so then this decision basically said, okay, they have the right and the ability to opt out.
And what are some of the numbers here in like how many teachers have left their unions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the National Education Association, in 2017, they had over 3 million members and fee payers. So they were including, agency fee payers there who were not members of the union, but 87,000 of those were agency fee payers. So I think that would be people who were who were not technically members of the union, but were paying. So maybe they were in these non-right to work states where they didn't want to be a member, but they had to pay. So in 2023, 6 years later and 5 years after the Janus ruling, they had 2.8 million members and no agency fee payers. So they lost several thousand members in that. So a 7% decrease in those 6 years. And then in the American Federation of Teachers, in 2018, they had 1.7 million members and fee payers, and roughly the similar amount of agency fee payers. So like the members who are like people who are not members of the union but are paying the agency fees. There are 85,000, just roughly 85,000 who are, not members, but were paying that agency fee. And again, probably in non-right to work states where they couldn't opt out, but they didn't want to be a member of the union. And then in 2023, they reported having 1,719,000 members. So like a slight decrease there. But of the fee payers, there was only 2,600 roughly. So a huge decline there. So they like a 2.5% decrease in total membership, essentially. So smaller than the NEA. I mean, and so there's like a less of a decline there. But with that agency fee payer, I think that's where they saw the most hit. And so I think it really shows you had people who were paying agency fees to the union. They maybe didn't agree with it ideologically or didn't really want to be a part of it for whatever reason. It could just be, you didn't want to align yourselves with the local union or the national union and just didn't want to do it. But you had to pay your union agency fee. But that declined vastly, like quite a bit in both cases, but specifically with the NEA in those years. So it's kind of a big jump, and I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about that and trying to quantify like how many teachers have left over time.
And what organizations are popping up to offer kind of alternatives, other services that usually the unions provide, and what are some of those services that they're offering?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Freedom Foundation is probably one of the biggest ones that's really stepped in, and it did that like about a decade ago. It started turning itself toward helping public employees leave their union, and that was even before the Janus case. And I think they were involved with that Janus case in some ways. So, but basically they said, like we see that there are these teachers who might want to leave their union, maybe they're not sure how. We're going to kind of create these resources to help them do that. And, they've been like what they're doing, I think, is quite controversial. They're coming out there and saying we're taking a stance on unions. We're going to say like we should help teachers get out of them. So yeah, I think that they're one of the biggest ones. They put together an annual summit for teachers, and they now are putting together like a teacher freedom network to provide support for teachers who are similarly situated. And essentially, like what they're going to offer is like through the Association of American Educators, which is like another one of these organizations that wants to provide alternatives. You can get liability insurance. So that's something that's typically offered by teachers unions. But basically, if something happens at work and you're sued in your official capacity, then it would protect you up to so many $1 million in terms of like liability, right? Like you wouldn't be personally liable for something that you did professionally if you were sued in your official capacity. And so that they want to be able to point teachers to like these different organizations. And then there are, some of these like less national, but like still like different kinds of possibilities that they'd probably try to direct teachers to, are like, having a local nonpartisan union, right? Like it's sort of not related to the NEA or the AFT, and could be nonpartisan, and it could just be, just represent teachers and say, hey, we would like to put teachers and teachers' issues in front of our employer and you negotiate for the best contract, the most time off, the highest pay, but not be affiliated with some of these national unions for whatever reason. It could be ideological, could just be like money, like it's cheaper to have like a smaller union that you're not paying, different dues to the state and state and federal level of your organization. So I think there's some of those different kinds of things. Again, this is pretty controversial. A lot of people will say, hey, you're freeloading if you're not paying your union dues. Like if you want to opt out of these kinds of things or do that, there's some different arguments there. So I think critics of these alternatives would say like, look, the union's doing a lot of work. But, then it gets back into the labor law a little bit of like these unions, they're the sole representatives of employees. So they're kind of like baked into the law there. So it's like, it gets kind of complicated then because you can't be a freeloader if you can go somewhere else, and you can't really go anywhere else because of the way that the law is. So it gets really complicated really fast, like a lot of the issues we talked about here, Eliana, but it's super interesting, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about, different kinds of unions, and we're going into a political cycle here. So I think that this will keep coming up.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.